morning. Thank you for joining us this morning at our May Global Café, Rethinking World Fairs and their role in U.S. diplomacy. I'm Pat Grout. I'm the Executive Director for Iowa International Center, and I really do want to welcome you all. And we know we have people from all over the world who are joining us this morning. So we're anxious to get started. We're excited, but let me go through some housekeeping things. I want to remind you that the session is being recorded, so everyone is being muted. And if you have any comments, please put them in the chat. And there will be time for question and answer at the end too. So if you have questions for any of our speakers, please put those in the chat as well. I do want to thank our speakers, and you'll learn more about them later. Today we are discussing World Fairs. And really they're now known as international expositions. But before we get started and get to the exciting parts, we're going to do a live poll. We'd like to know where you're from and what your experience with World Fairs or international expositions has been. And while you answer these two brief questions, I want to go on and just tell you a little bit more about World Fairs. World Fairs have happened in the U.S. and abroad for the last 60 years. The Expos are designed to showcase the achievements of all nations. I'm really excited to hear from all of our speakers today, but I am going to leave the introductions up to Jim Krissinger, who is our moderator for today. I'm really happy to introduce him as well. Jim is a longtime supporter and part of Iowa International Center. He is a retired public servant who worked with both Democratic and Republican administrations at multiple levels of government. The high point of his career was serving as a foreign service officer in the U.S. Embassy in Prague during the Velvet Revolution in 1889. Seems like so long ago. Jim has great stories. We love to hear him, and he has a great view and will do a good job. Jim, I am going to turn this over to you.
Thank you, Pat. And I look forward to facilitating our conversation today with our panelists. And speaking of our panelists, we have with us today Ethan Stanton. Ethan was the project coordinator for the USA Pavilion at Expo 2020 Dubai, where he assisted efforts to develop the exhibition and content inside the pavilion, as well as finalize the pavilion's interagency elements, monitor the project's budget and contract, and report on real-time visitor engagement and media coverage to department leadership. We also have Maggie Lemire. Maggie is a filmmaker, oral historian, and National Geographic explorer whose work focuses on social and environmental issues. Maggie's a trained master naturalist and serves as oral historian for the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. And we have Miles Leonard. Miles grew up on a farm in rural Wisconsin. His studies brought him to Simpson College in Iowa. Miles sought adventure through leading student groups on tours of the Western United States. And more for our purposes today, he worked as a youth ambassador at the USA Pavilion at Expo 2020 Dubai. So to get us started, we'd love to hear from you, Maggie, about the oral history paper you worked on associated with Dubai, with Expos.
Thank you so much, Jim and Pat, for the introduction. And I'm really happy to be here today with the Iowa International Center and be talking about World's Fairs. So we can go to the next slide. And I'm going to sort of help ground our conversation a little bit around the history of World's Fairs. So I just finished completing 16 oral history interviews with former youth ambassadors who participated in World Fairs. You're going to hear about that a lot more from Miles, who just was one. And another oral historian, Anna Kaplan, interviewed Americans who went to World's Fairs within the US. And we ended up creating this paper called Experiencing Expos, an oral history of US citizens' engagement with World's Fairs 1962 to 2017. So just a note on what oral history is oral histories are essentially kind of life history interviews. We call them life history interviews because even though they're kind of about a particular topic, in this case, World's Fairs, we really want to understand the fuller context of who a person is and sort of how a particular event or experience shapes them, how they make meaning of it. We're not really looking for the facts, but more the sort of felt impacts and how an experience affects your worldview and what choices you make and how you think about yourself in the world. So our interviews were really interested in sort of, for people who went to World's Fairs, whether in the US or internationally, how did it impact their view of themselves in the world and their choices? We can go to the next slide. So just a little bit more about the paper. We did 46 interviews with 46 different individuals for about 6 months, starting last September. And it represented, I guess, 8 different expos, 4 in the US and 4 internationally. And the people from the US had a variety of different roles. They maybe worked at a World's Fair, and maybe they just visited as a child. It was quite a spectrum. Whereas the people who we interviewed who had participated in the World's Fairs abroad, or the Global Expos as they're now called, were all student or youth ambassadors. We can go to the next slide. So just to tell you a little bit more about what we found out about the US expos, and these were the interviews that my oral history partner on this project, Anna Kaplan, did. And the World's Fairs that she covered were Seattle in 1962, New York in 1964, San Antonio in 1968, and New Orleans in 1984. We saw there were sort of 2 categories of impacts. One was sort of the built impacts, and the other was the felt impacts. So for the built impacts, we saw that in the cities that participated, there was sort of a physical change. There were these enduring symbols that were created. So in Seattle, the Space Needle that a lot of us know was created as part of the World's Fair. In New York, Queens kind of came to prominence because it was emphasized over Manhattan because of the World Fair and where it was. In New Orleans, there was a lot of revitalization and the development of the Riverwalk, and it sort of became a more of a tourist destination. Those are sort of positive impacts. On the other hand, in San Antonio, there was the forced removal of a community and historic buildings as part of having and hosting the World's Fair. So overall, it was quite positive in that there was increased investment in cities, but sort of under the guise of urban renewal, there were a lot of sort of thorny and difficult issues that I think more contemporary World's Fairs are trying to address. Some of the felt impacts were that all of these cities were sort of positioned on a world stage, and the people who lived in them felt a lot of pride. All of these cities kind of became a gateway to the world for the people who lived in them, and sort of how they were seen and positioned. And the people who went to the World's Fairs kind of had these experiences where overall difference became less scary. And that wasn't only because there were people from all over the world in their cities, it was also because people from within their cities came to the World's Fair and sort of met each other. So in Seattle, there were many Black musicians who were prominently featured, and so it created spaces of exchange across racial difference. People who were disabled were accommodated and more visible, which was less common at that time. And in San Antonio, Spanish language and culture was really valued, which was also progressive at that time. So it created spaces of exchange that were unique and powerful. And people who participated talked about it sort of planting the seed of wanting to travel and see the world or changing their career trajectories. We can go to the next slide. So for the expos abroad that were more recent that I did the oral histories on, these were in Shanghai in 2010, South Korea in 2012, Italy in 2015, and Kazakhstan in 2017. And I interviewed youth ambassadors who basically went and spent anywhere between 3 to 6 months working in the US Pavilion as part of the expo. And it was their job to sort of be a docent and help people experience the pavilion and to have side conversations and to host them and to sort of give them orientation and help guide them through and sometimes give presentations. And the students who participated had a variety of reasons for going. Some students had sort of cultural or family ties to the host country, but more than anything, all of these students were really, really wanting a deeper experience of living and working abroad. And so the expo was an experience or an opportunity not only to sort of study abroad or go on a 2-week trip, but to really live and work and be supported through this program with the State Department for many months to get a much deeper experience. And the impacts of these international expos were for the people in the host countries, so their own citizens and visitors, it really helped them have a much broader idea of who Americans are. So the students who participated weren't, blonde, blue-eyed, white people exclusively, but they came from many different, of course, backgrounds and immigrant experiences. And so it really challenged stereotypes of what an American is. And it showed that Americans can speak different languages. And people were able to engage with youth ambassadors on kind of critical conversations around issues like food security. For the youth ambassadors who participated, it sort of transformed and deepened their identity as an American. One youth ambassador said that they realized they could be patriotic without being nationalistic. And it sort of helped them understand themselves as an American through these experiences of exchange. It sparked a deeper interest in understanding US history and ties to these different communities and cultures, even within the US, like the Chinese American community. And it also, I think for most students, created a deeper interest in continuing to live and work abroad. And so many of the students I interviewed were actually still living abroad, and they work in international education and exchange, maybe business, fashion. Some people became foreign service officers. So for all of them, it was sort of this incredible moment in their trajectory where it really deepened a life of working internationally. And also, I think it really helped complicate their worldviews, where they saw issues not as sort of simple black and white or good or evil. They understood the differences between people and governments and had a really nuanced way of thinking about contemporary issues. We can go to the next slide. So overall, all of the narrators that my oral historian partner, Anna Kaplan, and I spoke to agreed that expos are pretty vital and important, that investment in them is important because it's such a rare form for people across cultures and communities to come together and have these moments of exchange. And that's particularly important because many of the people who go to World's Fairs may never have the opportunity to travel abroad and to meet people from different countries. And they all felt that the US government should continue to invest in World's Fairs even more than they have in the past through actual federal funding. And that, these events really matter more now than ever, coming out of COVID, where we haven't been able to travel as much, and with the rise of kind of misinformation and propaganda. So that's a little bit about the research, and I'm happy to answer some questions when we get to that part of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maggie. Ethan, now that we've talked a little bit more about the history of Expos, maybe you could tell us about Dubai 2020 Expo and what you think is coming up next for Expos.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jim. Let me share my screen here. While I do that, thank you to the Iowa International Center for putting this event together. We're really excited to be able to talk to Americans about Expos and what we've done in Dubai, and then what we're looking forward to in the future. So while this loads, a little bit about me. My name is Ethan. I work at the Department of State, where I'm a program analyst in the International Expositions Unit, also known as just the Expo Unit. Our office was established in 2016 as sort of the central office in the US government that handles and manages US participation in Expos, as well as our direct conduit to engage with the Bureau of International Expositions, which is the international body that governs Expos, which is based in Paris. And I really wanted to talk today first and foremost about what we did in Dubai, which was the most recent Expo. It actually occurred from October to the end of March, 2021 to 2022. It was delayed a year due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but the naming rights remain, so it's still Expo 2020 Dubai. And I wanted to talk a little bit about our USA Pavilion in Dubai. It's pictured here, here kind of lit up at night. You could see the sign and the big facade in the front. The other picture is one of our exhibits, Exhibit 4 on the inside. And really, that should give some context as to the scale of this, of our pavilion in Dubai. It's over 44,000 square feet, which is a little bit larger than the White House. So it's a very big, fixture. We had 8 exhibits in the pavilion that visitors went through and sort of experienced different concepts of America. The general theme that the pavilion fell under was life, liberty, and the pursuit of the future. And more specifically, we talked about how American innovation, ingenuity, and really our history as a country has enabled inventions and progress that makes the world a better place for everyone. So we welcomed over 1.2 million in-person visitors from across the globe over the 6-month event. And the visitors, again, under this theme, really saw, everything from kind of big picture items like, the invention of the smartphone and the iPhone, or what we're doing currently in quantum computing, all the way down to more kind of grassroots level innovation, including, how we are helping deliver medical supplies to communities in Africa and things of that nature. So really trying to showcase this ingenuity and innovation, but not just at kind of the top levels, but also how just kind of everyday Americans are doing really cool things, really innovative things to help the world. In our pavilion, we also had some very interesting artifacts that we were very happy to have. We had a few lunar samples on loan from NASA, otherwise known as moon rocks. We had a replica Mars rover from Cornell University that was a 1-to-1 replica of the real thing that's currently in outer space. And then perhaps most impactfully, we also obtained the original version of Thomas Jefferson's Quran that he had, which we were able to display in the pavilion for about 3 months. Obviously, this was the first World Expo in the Middle East, North Africa region. So having, a US founding father and showing that he had a Quran that he annotated and marked up and read was really impactful to the audience that came through the expo. And it sort of highlighted that, diversity and religious tolerance really does go back all the way to our founding. So we're very happy to have that courtesy of the Library of Congress. And so moving forward, that's, a little overview on the pavilion itself. But I think really, what I believe makes our pavilion and makes our participation special is in part our youth ambassador program that Maggie talked a little bit about earlier. We really call them our faces of America because they do really represent all of America. This year in Dubai, we had 75 total youth ambassadors who were aged anywhere from 18 to 29 years old, and they hailed from 37 states, including the District of Columbia. They were affiliated with over 70 colleges and universities, and then in addition to English, they spoke over 20 languages. And I think something I'm proud of and that our office is really proud of is that we really sought to have a very diverse cohort of youth ambassadors, and really across the entire spread. So not only, racial and ethnic diversity, but geographic diversity, socioeconomic diversity, and ensuring that all Americans, if able, could participate in this program. I was born and raised in California. I love California people, but, we don't necessarily need 75 youth ambassadors from, California or New York, right? It's great when we have young people who are from the Midwest, who are from the South, who are from the Southwest, who can speak to different parts of the country to foreign audiences. And I'm really, really happy that we have Miles with us today. Miles was a youth ambassador in Dubai, from Wisconsin originally, and then, obviously going to school in Iowa. So I'm really excited to kind of turn it over to Miles and, talk more about his direct experiences being a youth ambassador in Dubai. Because while I spent time at the expo, Miles was actually there, every day, kind of doing the hard work of not only guiding people through the pavilion, but really being that direct engagement to foreign audiences every single day, right? As kind of the American representative. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Miles now and let him tell you more about his time in Dubai.
Hello, everybody. I'm Miles. So my experience at the Expo in Dubai was a pretty incredible one. I actually went from someone who did not think World Expos, World Fairs were still happening. I actually was like, oh, that's something that happened in history, but they're not really going on anymore. I didn't even realize that they were still contemporarily like happening. And I feel that was a fairly common experience among youth ambassadors from the United States. I feel like us in the US don't have as much exposure to it or awareness of it happening around the world. And so when I got this opportunity, I was really excited to go abroad. I had studied abroad in university, and cultural exchange was something I was very passionate about. And I've included some photos here so you guys can see a little bit more about my day to day. It was such a unique experience at Expo because every day you were there, something new was happening and you were learning about new cultures, whether that would be countries celebrating individual holidays or having festivals around their food or other cultural practices. You'd walk through Expo and there would be cultural performers from different countries and you'd just learn new things just simply from walking through the space. Being a youth ambassador was a really amazing opportunity to get to know people within the pavilion. So while obviously a lot of our job is health and safety in the pavilion and making sure guests are making their way through in a safe manner, one of the best aspects, and I believe almost all of the other YAs would agree with me, is there were positions we would love because it gave us the opportunity to just talk directly with guests one-on-one, get to know, what country are they from? What brought them to the Expo? Have they ever been to an Expo before? It was also exciting to have such a diverse group of youth ambassadors because we were able to, for example, reference people to other YAs. If someone was like, oh, I visited the US 20 years ago and I stayed in Minnesota, for example. I had a guy, one of the other YAs directed him to me and we bonded over the fact that we'd both been to the Mall of America. He was Emirati, so for him it was the world's biggest mall until, as he said, they beat us with their world's biggest mall. So it was really fun to get these little moments of intercultural exchange, and truly that person-to-person contact is so powerful. And so just to tell you a little bit more about the photos here on the screen, on the one side where you see all of us in front of the pavilion, that was us on UAE Flag Day. It was their flag day, and so they were handing out these stoles with the UAE flag on it. And you can see that was actually my first crew, my first month there at Expo. And so that was our team for the day. We wore those all day to help celebrate the holiday as a way of cultural exchange and, participation. And on the other side there, you can see me in our exhibit with our replica Mars rover. Part of the role as well was education about the exhibits themselves. So I got to learn a lot about NASA and about our Mars rover, and then share that information with others. And could we see the other slide? And so here, another really cool experience, if you look on the left side of your screen, is I got to work with the USA Pavilion Fellows, which was a fellow program that had a lot of young professionals from the MENA region. And so that opportunity to not only network with them, but share one-on-one with them my experience coming from the US, answering their questions and helping to guide them around the Expo was another really unique experience and something that happened a lot, whether we were helping cultural performers around Expo or helping delegations through our pavilion. And then if you look on the other side, that's our whole USA Pavilion team. I think almost everyone is there. So it's really exciting to see the whole crew together. But yeah, so that's kind of an overview of my time in Dubai. I really enjoyed the experience of getting to learn more about the UAE as well, getting to learn more about the culture there, and the hospitality was absolutely amazing. And I just am so grateful I've had this opportunity to learn so much about other cultures and also share my upbringing, share Wisconsin, share Iowa, share the different states that have impacted my life with an international audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Miles. And just, one last tidbit on my end on the Youth Ambassador Program. I think, we're always striving to learn and improve and improve the program. And our participation in World Expos is not always perfect, but I think that one thing we have done very well that has become sort of a best practice in the Expo community is our Youth Ambassador Program. And that is really, in my opinion, and in exit surveys for people who visit our pavilion, the youth ambassador engagement and interaction is always something that's, found incredibly positive. So I'm really proud of Miles and all of our youth ambassadors for what they did in Dubai. The other component that we have just beyond the physical pavilion is our cultural performer and speaker program. We partnered with Global Ties US, who helped organize this event, to recruit a cohort of cultural performers from across the country to really showcase all different forms of American culture. We ended up with 189 performances and 39 speaking events specifically at the USA Pavilion, but in total over 240 events across the entire Expo site. The Expo 2020 site was massive, and there were many different stages and theaters and other venues for our cultural performers to perform at beyond just the actual US Pavilion. We had over 58,000 attendees at events at the USA Pavilion and across the Expo site. And probably most proudly, our cultural performers were affiliated with all 50 US states, which again was very big for us to recruit and showcase a very diverse set of cultural performances across all of America. And I think what's important to note too about this program is that it is it's entertainment, it's entertaining foreign audiences, but it is also showcasing different elements of US culture, right? Whether it's a bluegrass band from Mississippi, or a dance group that highlights disabled Americans. There are some really, really cool and diverse and unique performers and groups that highlight more than just what foreign audiences might assume is American kind of Hollywood culture, right? So that kind of grassroots element is really important, and that actually is a large part of our, the Department of State's and the U.S. government's overall pivot and dedication to showing and doing these cultural exchanges. We also had some very cool culinary diplomacy events with Disney, sports diplomacy with the Harlem Globetrotters. So again, just really kind of diverse and a little bit of everything. And this picture here actually is the Tulane University Marching Band, which was a huge hit when they visited Expo. And we did have a very cool Iowa connection. Members from 7 different cultural programs came from the general Midwest region, including Iowa. So we're really happy again just to be able to say that we had all 50 US states represented in our cultural performer program, which was important and kind of a goal from us from the beginning. In addition to the cultural programs and the actual US Pavilion, we also had a robust business program at our pavilion. We had a function and event space, which hosted over 170 different events, hosted over 250 international business delegations. We signed MOUs, with American businesses and UAE partners. And we also had state trade delegations come visit the US Pavilion, hold meetings, and we helped facilitate other meetings across the Expo site. Again, Expo is a little bit of everything. It's obviously, from a kind of tourist standpoint, very fun. You get to go to all the different country pavilions and all the different performances. But there's also a very distinct business programming element to Expo writ large. So that's something we really tried to focus on too, to make sure we were promoting American businesses, in the region and in the UAE specifically. So to wrap up the Dubai section of my presentation, I want to play a video for you that's kind of our farewell video from the US Pavilion.
Hi, I'm Bob Clark. I'm here to welcome you to the US Pavilion. Come and see the American dream.
The USA Pavilion at Expo 2020 Dubai welcomed over 1.5 million visitors. For those 6 months, guests from around the world experienced our theme of life, liberty, and the pursuit of the future. which celebrated the American people, ideas, and contributions that have changed and improved lives in the United States and around the world. Expo 2020 Dubai was one of the largest events of its kind ever to be held in the Middle East. The USA Pavilion provided a unique platform to share American culture, promote mutual understanding, engage global audiences, and support international business opportunities.
The United States greatly appreciates the UAE's commitment to a successful, inclusive, safe, and healthy Expo for everyone.
The USA Pavilion at Expo 2020 allowed us to share our American history, to promote mutual understanding, and to highlight our commitment to a rules-based international system. Thank you for joining us on our World's Fair journey. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of the future.
All right, so that is a farewell from our pavilion in Dubai. So moving forward, we're looking ahead to the future and future expos, and we're currently in the midst of a bid to host Expo 2027 back in the United States in Minnesota. The voting to host Expo 2027 Minnesota will take place within the next year. This is a specialized expo, so it's a 3-month expo in 2027, in between two of the bigger 6-month ones. We're currently competing against 4 other countries, but Minnesota in the United States has a very strong bid, a strong theme that focuses on global health and sustainability. Their theme is Healthy People, Healthy Planet. The bid really is more than just Minnesota too. It's been recognized by the president as being in the national interest. So it's the federal bid to host an expo. And it's really something that, will not only impact, the direct, Minnesota and the Minneapolis area with economic activity and tourism, but really it's something to get, people in the United States more invested in World's Fairs, right? It is not always easy to travel to a World's Fair when it's, in Dubai or somewhere else it's far away. But it being, now in Minnesota is another avenue to kind of, open up this whole world to Americans who might not otherwise have the opportunity to experience it. And it would be the first time in over 40 years that the US would have hosted a World's Fair. So it's been a really long time, and there's a lot of excitement in the expo community that the United States is back, on the international stage, engaging, at the BIE, the Bureau of International Expositions, and trying to bring the World's Fair back to the United States. And then before that, there is the next big 6 months World's Fair, which happens in 2025 in Osaka, Japan. The theme for this expo is Designing a Future Society for Our Lives, which focuses on the future and sustainability, and sort of living cohesively. It's going to be an incredibly large public diplomacy and economic diplomacy event in the Indo-Pacific region. It will be the largest, frankly, since the 2010 Expo in Shanghai, which drew 70 million visitors, to Shanghai. The Japanese are estimating that they're going to get about 28 million in-person visitors. But of course, that number could go up tremendously. And that doesn't include any virtual engagements. So, we're currently, with Dubai sort of over and wrapping up, we're focused on the bid for Minnesota, for us to win the rights to bring the World's Fair back to the United States, but we're also in the process of planning for a US pavilion in Osaka. These events are large. They take a lot of effort, not only from the Department of State, but really across the entire US government, the Departments of Commerce, in the White House, et cetera. So, these are multi-year planning events. So that's why we're starting early for Osaka. So currently we're exploring different themes for a US pavilion, working on securing the necessary funding for a USA pavilion, as well as designing what the exhibition would look like, what our youth ambassador program would look like, and what our cultural performer program would look like. So it's very exciting. Japan's hosted expos in the past. They always do a very, very good job. So the expo in Osaka is going to be very, very exciting. And I think it's something to look forward to. So with that, I will end there. We have a contact page. If you want to learn more about what our office does, you could follow us to the Expo Unit website on state.gov. And if you were curious to know more about what we did in Dubai, the USA Pavilion website is still active, so you can go look there. And we also have our Pavilion social media accounts active as well, which include YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, so you can really get a good picture of what actually happened at the USA Pavilion and at the Expo site. So I'll stop there. And again, thank you for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions you might have about Dubai or about future expos.
Thank you, Ethan and Miles. We're going to move into the Q&A portion of our hour, and I'd like to ask Maggie to get us started. Maggie, what was the most interesting part of this topic as compared to the other work you've done?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, thank you, Ethan, for your presentation, and Miles for sharing your experience. Honestly, talking to the former youth ambassadors felt like speaking to peers in a way for me, because they had all had really substantive, transformative experiences living and working abroad as I have. Although I wasn't a youth ambassador, I really was so impressed with them, and in particular by the fact that they all really thought in shades of gray and were extremely critical thinkers, not only about expos, but about global issues. And I felt like that is so important in terms of the type of citizens that we want, and who can really engage in really critical, challenging issues globally right now. The youth ambassadors, by and large, said that this was an overwhelmingly positive and worthwhile experience, but they also really wanted to share deep reflections, about what could be done better, which I think is really important too. They talked about sort of with the exhibitions, what they would like to sort of see improve so that it's a little bit more dynamic and there's deeper stories and even more critical conversations that can happen interculturally. They were really thoughtful about sort of the funding that is involved in expos, and sort of wanting the US to commit more funding to this type of exchange and soft power, compared to sort of like our military budget, for example. So I just really deeply enjoyed talking to them, and was really impressed by, even if it had been 10 years ago for some of them, how much they still reflected on this experience and were invested in sort of being part of the conversation about how they can be improved going forward, from exhibition and design to the youth ambassador program itself. So it was really fun, and just I learned a lot from every person. So I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Maggie. Miles, could you maybe share what was your biggest takeaway from your experience as a youth ambassador at Dubai?
Yeah, I mean, I would say my biggest takeaway is definitely just how important continued US involvement in World Expos, and with the potential of the Minnesota Expo trying to bring the World Expo back to the United States. I really you know, every chance I get when I'm back home here, I love to tell people about the World Expo. And again, most of the response I get is, wow, I didn't know they were still doing those. I didn't know that was still a thing. Just continued exposure of the United States, of citizens from the United States to international expos and to an international audience and to this form of cultural exchange, as well as the importance that the US remains present and actively involved in expos abroad, because it was such an amazing opportunity for us to represent our country, to represent ourselves, and to make those personal connections with international individuals. I mean, it is vital to American international diplomacy, in my opinion, after being there and just seeing the impact it had on visitors and, you know, on us youth ambassadors as well. I would say that is my biggest takeaway.
Thanks, Miles. And Ethan, based on the oral histories and what we've been hearing, how might all that affect future expos?
Yeah, I think the oral history project is really important. I mean, by way of background, you know, our office was established in 2016 after the United States rejoined the BIE. And before that, you know, the Department of State, organized expos on sort of an ad hoc basis, where our regional bureaus, you know, wherever, if it was Italy or China, wherever the expo was taking place, the regional bureaus would handle the participation. The issue with that is that there was no institutional memory after each expo, which made it difficult to really, you know, hot wash and learn from experiences, both good and bad. So the Dubai Expo was kind of important in that it was the first expo in which, you know, we had kind of a centralized office to retain control over the program in the pavilion, as well as just execute more of the content in the exhibition and the Youth Ambassador program, whereas in the past, that was usually the responsibility of a private implementing partner. So that's a roundabout way of saying, I think, you know, it's important to look at what we do well, but it's more important to look at what we fell short of and what we can do better. And, you know, the oral history project, talking to youth ambassadors and really trying to onboard as much information as we can, is going to be really, really important when we start planning, or when we are planning for Osaka, in terms of, you know, trying to replicate what we've done well, but also being very clear-eyed about where we fell short and what we can do better in the future. So I think in that regard, the oral history project, communicating with youth ambassadors, taking value at our exit surveys that we had at the pavilion, are really critical for Osaka and beyond.
Thank you, Ethan. We do have now a question from our audience, and I think maybe it's a question for Ethan, but feel free, any of you, take a whack at it. So the question is, did the US Pavilion concept focus more on the technology that was made in the US, or did it have a cultural introduction to American culture as a country?
Good question. It did focus more on technology in the United States. I will say that the first exhibit that, you know, guests would walk through, that did focus more on sort of our founding as a country, and more a little bit about our culture and our values, to kind of, you know, lay the groundwork for the rest of the pavilion. But after that, a lot of the content did focus mainly on technology and innovation writ large. But I guess the caveat there too, though, is that with our youth ambassadors and with our cultural program, there was still a strong emphasis for anyone going through the pavilion to learn more about American culture, you know, in that regard, which, you know, I don't know if Miles, if you have some more insights into that, but I do know that from a cultural standpoint, we did lean heavily on our youth ambassadors and their interactions and engagements, you know, with the foreign audiences coming through the pavilion.
You want to add to that, Miles?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I feel that was quite a role of the youth ambassadors, was representing our own cultures. Obviously, we're a very diverse group, but at the root of it all, we're all American. And so representing how our American identities come into play with where we grew up, our different socioeconomic, ethnic backgrounds, things like that, but yet still all at the heart being American, I think was a very powerful part of the diversity of our Youth Ambassador program and our role there at the pavilion. We also had a really cool, for part of the expo, we had a Meet an American booth where you could actually volunteer to come in, and we had a little booth that had a sign, Meet an American, and you had a little bio about you, what state you're from, your background, just kind of any information you wanted to tell the guests. And you would get the opportunity to take direct questions from guests about, anything they have about, the United States, about living in the US, things like that, which was really cool. So yeah, I would say that was where it was mostly highlighted. And again, in the first exhibit, I believe we did a really good job highlighting the aspect of religious freedom in the United States and our ties to the region as well, which I think was a really cool choice that was made.
That sounds like a good segue to our next audience question. And it's a question for Miles. What was the most, did your experience feel like diplomacy? How did it change your perspective on diplomacy?
I would definitely say it did. I did not study international relations or public diplomacy or anything like that. My background's actually in communications and multimedia journalism, but it definitely did feel like that, on a small scale. Our job was to accurately, but also positively represent the United States, as well as introduce the foreign audience to the different ideas that went through our pavilion. And also we gave them active ways to engage back with the United States. In our final exhibit, we had places where they could get more information, for example, on studying in the United States. That was honestly my favorite booth to plug, is tell people like, hey, if you're interested, we have this really great resource to help you find, opportunities to study in the US, because that was something there were a lot of students coming through Expo. And so the opportunity to sort of plug that, as well as traveling the United States, people would ask you like, oh, how can I learn more about this? And then also we did get often harder questions about more serious topics, specifically one, obviously, that you couldn't really get away with was gun violence in the United States. So questions about, how safe do you feel living in the US? How do you deal with all of the gun violence going on around you? It's an issue international audiences see a lot about the United States in news. So addressing harder topics like this was definitely part of the job as well, while also, maintaining the excitement and the positive nature of Expo. So it was a really interesting experience to navigate, and I'm really grateful for it.
Yeah, Miles, you anticipated a little bit the next question, which is also for you, and that is, when you were interacting with folks there, what was the most common question you heard about the United States, and what was the most surprising question about the United States you got?
So I would definitely say the most common one was about safety. And like 100% was, do I feel safe in the United States? And, it's an interesting question to tackle, because yes, I do. Like, I live here, I grew up here. We do have these issues, but overall, I feel safe here in the United States. But kind of figuring out how to express that and express that issue was very interesting. So that would honestly be the most common question. I'm trying to think of the most interesting question. I'm having trouble thinking of a strange question right now. We definitely got them, and we would share them with each other whenever we got one, but I'm just having trouble thinking of one right now.
But it sounds like a fabulous experience, Miles. Our next question from the audience is, maybe Ethan would be best to address this. Do you think it's possible for the coordinating organizations to adequately support queer student ambassadors in potentially hostile environments? How is this in the UAE? I'm specifically interested in the trade-off between being able to highlight diversity within the cohort and the ability to support students of other backgrounds.
Yeah, great question. I think it's absolutely possible for whether it's us, the Department of State, our implementing partner, which in this case was Global Ties US, and then obviously our mission on the ground, which was the US Consulate in Dubai and the Embassy in Abu Dhabi, to support youth ambassadors of all backgrounds and all identities. I think when you're in certain parts of the world where cultural norms are different, it's going to be more challenging. But that said, that's a critical, I think, feature of the program is ensuring that, yes, we want to recruit a diverse cohort, but with that, means you need to deploy the resources to support them when they're in the field. And that comes, I think, in a multitude of ways. And it's not easy, right? It can be difficult, but that is something that the U.S. government, whether it's a Fulbright program that we send students out on, different study abroad programs, language programs, it is always a feature to ensure that students, youth, people we send out on these programs, are supported by the U.S. government, even if they're in environments that might pose different challenges than they might, in the United States or elsewhere. I think that's something that we're going to continue to refine and ensure that, these students do have all the support they need. And again, that goes back, I think, to the kind of an earlier question about, how we learn from what we've done in the past and how do we make things better. And it's very easy, obviously, to only want to hear the good things and what you did really well, but it's important to hear about where you can do better. And if that means, supplying more resources to our youth ambassadors, to our cultural performers, to other staff, to make sure that they feel supported and that they feel safe and included, that's something that is very important for us to continue to refine and be better at. So I think that's a great question. I'm happy to say that I think in Dubai we really strove, and I think we were successful in that regard. But I will also say that that is not to say that we can't improve it further. But great question.
Maybe building on that, Maggie, could you talk a little bit more about how your work is going to inform future experience, and maybe broaden it out a little bit by how your work may support diplomacy in general?
Yeah, thank you. I can add on a little bit to both of those questions. So one of the things that I thought was impressive about the Youth Ambassador program was the youth ambassadors were actually encouraged, it sounded like, from the majority of interviews, to share their own opinions, to do so diplomatically, but they weren't just sort of meant to be like robotic, I'm an American, like, let's actually have conversations across difference. And I thought that was really important and a great positive with a variety of perspectives, as Miles was talking about. There could be a lot of different perspectives on that question of safety. So I think it's really interesting to hear maybe how different people approach it, and that was encouraged. On the other hand, there were definitely challenges, and I think that's why this conversation is really important, between the different partners, including the State Department and Global Ties, the youth ambassadors. And I think oral history is this great opportunity to sort of capture those harder moments as well. And they definitely came up. In our fuller report, there was a good amount of kind of conversation about how students of color or queer students, had experiences that were very challenging for them, sometimes just out of ignorance, sometimes racism, where really difficult questions, things like that, were brought to them, where they had, even students who were maybe of a different cultural background, they would be more criticized for their language skills. There were a lot of different experiences where they had a lot of challenges with safety and security. And so I think, as Ethan was kind of alluding to, with the office being created and this research being done, a lot of this is really very much in the spirits of lessons learned, and sort of making sure that that institutional memory that wasn't captured is being captured now. And there were a lot of challenges. It's just interesting because, as I was sort of saying earlier, all of the students who I spoke to, for the most part, were really glad they had the experience, even if it was challenging. But there are challenges. And I think just they were very reflective and kind of naturally invested in sort of how this moves forward. And, I think the other thing about sort of their diplomatic skills, I think one of the other kind of lasting takeaways is a lot of the students I talked to, or former student youth ambassadors, is that they realize that as Americans, we're sort of in these constant ambassadorships in our presence and being in other countries and interacting. And I think that's something that endures for them, much beyond the experience of this official role, and sort of all that that can hold, which can be extraordinarily challenging and extremely positive as well. And so one positive takeaway, I think, was that a lot of the former youth ambassadors really did gain this skill set around, not only like public speaking, but genuinely diplomacy and how to have these harder or deal with these more difficult cross-cultural interactions at times. So
thank you, Maggie. I think we're about out of time now, and I would like to offer my thanks to our panelists, Maggie and Ethan, and I'm going to turn things back over to Pat now.
Thank you, Jim. That was a great discussion. I really I wish I could, have coffee with each of you instead of virtually here today. Before we go any further though and close out, one of the things that we didn't do earlier was find out where everybody is from and their experiences with World Fairs, international expositions. So we have our poll ready. Oh, there we go. So you can see most of our people today were from North America. All right. And all right, what's the next question, Cassie? Karen.
I'm not sure on your screen, but then the next question
There they
about.
are. I got it now. That's why I just usually have to talk because I'm not the technical person. All right, so great. I think that's pretty amazing. It's a pretty even split on who's been to World's Fairs and who hasn't. I, for one, am really excited about the future World Expositions that we talked about. Jim, I want to thank you for guiding us through this conversation. I want to thank the Department of State and the International Visitor Leadership Program. It's another great soft diplomacy thing, and also Global Ties US. Importantly, I want to thank Maggie, Ethan, and Miles for spending time with us and sharing your experiences and your stories. There are more stories there. I hope we get to hear more along the way. And thank you all for attending today. The world is small. In Iowa, we tend to often think about the Iowa State Fair, but really it's those global experiences that bring us all closer together. So please be on the lookout for our next Global Cafe coming in June, in the latter part of June. So thank you for attending, and we'll see you all later. Bye-bye.